The road was mostly empty, only a few distant headlights cutting through the darkness. Nathan was driving home after a long day, his suit jacket neatly draped over the passenger seat. He had driven this road hundreds of times before. Tonight had no reason to be any different. But suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in the rearview mirror. A familiar but never pleasant feeling squeezed Nathan's chest. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and pushed the car gently to the side of the road. His hands were clearly on the wheel as he waited. He knew how to act in these situations. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind him, a bright flashlight beamed through the driver's window, blinding him for a second. "License and registration," the officer barked. The other stood slightly behind, his hand on his holster. Nathan slowly reached for his wallet, trying to keep his movements slow and predictable. "May I ask why I was stopped?" The officer didn't answer, just flashed his flashlight around the car. "Do you live around here?" Nathan's jaw tensed, but his voice remained calm. "Yes, I just got home from work." The officer curled his lips in a mocking smile. "What do you do?" Nathan raised his head, looking the man in the eye. "I'm a judge." The air suddenly fell into a tense silence. The second officer let out a snort. "A judge? Do you have the ID to prove it?" Nathan said nothing, just silently handed over his driver's license and work papers. The first officer took them, glanced at them, and then shoved them back. "Get out of the car." Nathan frowned. "Did I do something wrong?" "Get out. Now." Nathan's throat was dry, but he knew better than to argue. He unbuckled his seatbelt, slowly opened the door, and stepped out, keeping his hands where they could see. Before he could react, the officer behind him grabbed his hands and twisted them behind his back. "What crime?" Nathan's voice was calm, though his insides were churning. The cold click of handcuffs locked his wrists. A chuckle rang out behind him. "We'll figure it out later." The police entered the courthouse the next morning, their smugness still on their faces. But when the courtroom doors opened, they froze. Nathan, in his stern black judge's robes, sat on the highest bench, looking down at them. His eyes no longer had the patience of last night. There was only absolute coldness. The officer swallowed. This time, they were the ones waiting for their fate to be decided. Nathan didn't resist. He didn't do anything. But he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him like an invisible boulder. Heavy. Inescapable. The second officer quietly took Nathan's wallet from the hood of the car, flipped through the papers, shook his head, and muttered. "This guy is a big talker." Then he smirked, his voice contemptuous. "Judge my ass." Nathan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew the system too well. Too well to understand what was going on. Too well to realize that the truth had no weight. And he knew one thing for sure, these cops didn't know who they'd just handcuffed. But they were about to find out. Nathan's wrists were cold under the steel. The cuffs were tighter than they needed to be, heavier than they really were. An invisible punishment he couldn't escape. His fingers flexed instinctively, testing the limits of his movement. It wasn't the first time he'd worn handcuffs. But he'd been on the other side before. He'd seen them in court, locked around the wrists of men and women whose fates he'd decided. People who believed that justice would protect them. Just like he'd believed. But tonight, justice wasn't here. A sharp tug. Metal biting into his skin. Nathan took a deep breath. He felt adrenaline coursing through his veins, but he refused to let it show. His instincts told him to stay calm. Not react. Not waver. Just watch. The second officer stepped closer, a smug smile on his face. "You think you're special?" His voice was venomous. "You think a judge can get you out of here?" Nathan stared at him, not responding. I told you the truth. The first officer sneered. Well, fine. But there's another truth you should know, you're not the one giving the orders here. We're the ones making the decisions. A rough hand pressed down on Nathan's shoulder, pushing him forward. The gravel crunched underfoot, each step felt like it didn't belong to him, like he was standing outside his body observing it all. He had always believed in the law. In its structure. In the power of justice. But tonight, the system he served was swallowing him whole. Face down, the first officer ordered as they reached the patrol car. Nathan hesitated for a second. Just a second. Then he leaned down, letting the cold breath of the night fill his lungs. In that moment, he was no longer a judge. No longer a doer of justice. He was just a man with his wrists tied. Sinking into the very system he once believed in. Nathan knew how this went. The moment those eyes locked on him, in the careless moment when his hand moved, maybe to reach for his phone, or just an unconscious gesture, he saw it in their eyes, alertness, doubt, and then, in a heartbeat, decision. He had seen it before, but this time, he was on the other side. He saw that it was a wrong move. A misunderstood gesture. And things could get worse. Quickly. In the blink of an eye. He didn't resist. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew it would only make things worse. Nathan leaned forward slowly, pressing his forehead against the cool surface of the car as they searched his pockets. Wallet. Phone. What is this? The second cop pulled out his ID, holding it up to eye level. Nathan heard the shuffle of fingers across hard plastic, heard the soft gasp as the man read the name out loud, his voice a mixture of sarcasm and surprise. Judge Nathaniel Carter. There was a moment of silence. A consideration. The first officer leaned over his colleague's shoulder, looking at the card. A low whistle escaped his lips. Take my ID and I'll be damned. He was, in fact, a judge. But that didn't mean anything. Nathan could see it in their eyes. There was no sudden reverence, no remorse. Just a whirlwind of quick thinking, figuring out how to handle this new situation. But then, it didn't take long. The first officer slid the ID card back into Nathan's wallet with an almost casual gesture. As if it didn't change anything. As if they had already made up their minds. Bring him in. Nathan raised his head, his voice low but firm. For what? The officer merely flicked his finger at the other man, who had begun to jot something down in an old notebook. Obstruction. Suspicious conduct. He shrugged. We'll figure it out. Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen this before. He had sat in the high chair of the courtroom, reading the files of similar cases. The charges were flimsy, barely enough to justify arrest. The defenses were baseless and would crumble under scrutiny. But right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had made up their minds. He was guilty in their eyes, though no one had to say it out loud. The door of the squad car swung open, and the first officer pushed Nathan inside. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable. The air in the car smelled of old sweat and cigarette ash. Nathan leaned back, staring at the metal partition between him and the front of the car. Through the windshield, the world outside continued. No one knew that a judge had just been arrested on a pointless charge. He closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't the first time he'd seen this happen. But this was the first time he'd been on the other side. Nathan sat still, his breathing slow and steady. He could see the second cop still snickering as he leaned against the hood of the car, talking into the radio. They thought they had won. They thought they had put someone else in their place. They had no idea what was coming. The station was colder than it needed to be. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a pale blue light washing everything into blurry shapes. Nathan sat on the hard chair in the cell, his hands resting casually on his knees. His wrist still bore the marks of the handcuffs, dark red marks, an indelible reminder of the night before. The pain was dull, but he didn't care anymore. It was nothing compared to what he had been through, compared to what he had seen. He watched the officers at the desk process his paperwork, their eyes flickering over him, glancing with varying expressions, curiosity, amusement, indifference. No one saw him as a person. Just another face in the cell. Another number in the system. The irony did not escape him. For years he had listened to accounts of abuse by law enforcement, stories that sometimes sounded fanciful. But now, sitting in this cell, he understood more than ever. He was not just hearing about the cracks in the system. He was inside them. Carter. The sound of his name pulled him from his thoughts. A sergeant stood outside the cell, holding a stack of files. His eyes scanned the paper, then settled on Nathan. An appraising, weighing look, before a curt, "You are free to go." Nathan did not respond immediately. "Charges?" His voice was low and dry. The sergeant exhaled sharply. "Put him down." Of course, they had nothing to hold him back. But they didn't need a reason to arrest him in the first place. It was all an excuse. A power play. An assertion of rank in a system that was all too familiar with swallowing people like him. The cell door opened. Nathan stood, his back straight, his eyes expressionless. He walked out, each step slow and calm, but inside, something was burning. Not anger. He had gotten over anger long ago. What he felt was something deeper. A slow simmer. An understanding. Nathan felt the cold metal as he picked up his wallet and phone from the front desk. No explanation, no apology, just a throwaway, as if he were nothing. But Nathan didn't need an apology. He just carefully tucked his ID back into his sleeve, his grip so tight his knuckles turned white. The front desk clerk leaned forward, his voice low but meaningful. "You were lucky tonight." Nathan looked him straight in the eye, a look that was brief but weighty. A small, unreadable smile played at the corners of his lips. Lucky? If so, it wasn't the luck of those who thought they had the right to put him where they wanted him. Stepping out of the building, Nathan took a deep breath of the night air. The world was still spinning, oblivious, or uncaring, to what had happened inside. The streetlights were still blinking, the cars were still speeding down the street, life was going on as if nothing had changed. But for Nathan, nothing was the same. This wasn't just another bad night. This was a turning point. And it would stay with him, not as a scar, but as a reminder. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Police uniforms, legal staff, a few reporters were whispering as they waited for the hearing to begin. Sergeant Daniel Briggs and Officer Kyle Mercer sat stiffly at the defense table. Their uniforms were pressed, their shoes were polished, but the usual confidence was missing from their faces. This wasn't a typical internal affairs investigation, not a hearing they could get out of with a few disclaimers. The accusations of racism, misconduct, and illegal detention were barely a whisper at first. But as the complaints poured in, as similar stories began to stack up like pieces of a dark puzzle, the department had no choice but to act. They knew how to play this game. Keep it quiet. Keep the statements brief. Let the union reps handle the technicalities. But then the door behind the bench opened. Nathan walked in. His black robe billowed behind him as he approached the judge's chair. He moved slowly, deliberately. His expression was unreadable. The silence in the courtroom suddenly became heavy. Briggs and Mercer didn't move, but Nathan could feel the tension tightening in their shoulders. They had seen him before, on a dark sidewalk, with his wrists locked behind his back, with sneer-like grins on their faces. But this time, the power dynamics had changed. This time, they were the ones waiting for the verdict. The room fell into absolute silence. No more whispers, no more rustling of papers or sighs. Everything was frozen. The officers were stiff in their chairs, their faces as pale as if the blood had drained from their bodies. Their lawyer glanced at them in confusion, his eyes full of questions, but none of them had answers. Briggs' mouth was dry, he swallowed, but it felt like there was a stone blocking it. Mercer was speechless, his face so white it was almost transparent. It took them a few seconds to understand what they were seeing, what was happening. But when the truth hit them, it was not only painful, it was a devastating blow. The man they had pushed into his car. The man they had laughed at. The man they had locked in a cell for no reason. It was Judge Nathaniel Carter. Nathan took his seat, adjusting the microphone slowly. His eyes scanned the room, slowly, considering each face, each expression. Finally, his gaze settled on them. No smiles. No satisfaction. Not a word. Not yet. Tension spread, an unbearable tension. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Mercer shifted in his chair, as if trying to escape this invisible confinement. His hands gripped the table. Briggs clenched his jaw so hard it looked painful, but he couldn't relax. Couldn't do anything else. Nathan rapped the gavel on the table. The sound rang out loud in the silence. This hearing will proceed. He let the silence drag on. He watched the understanding settle in their eyes. No more denial. No more excuses. They had arrested the very man who now had the power to decide their fate. Nathan let the silence linger for a few more beats. Long enough to ensure that this moment would never be forgotten. The courtroom was more than quiet. It was charged. Everyone knew what had happened. They could feel the irony, an invisible pressure that filled the room. Briggs cleared his throat, but no words came out. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but no matter how much he fidgeted, he couldn't escape the reality before him. Mercer stared at the table, his hands clenched as if he squeezed hard enough, he could make himself disappear. Finally, Nathan spoke. His voice was calm but commanding. Officers Briggs and Mercer, you are here today for multiple complaints of racial profiling, misconduct, and unlawful arrest. His words rang out, each syllable as sharp as a knife. You both deny these charges, asserting that the arrests were made on reasonable suspicion. His fingers tapped the table, rhythmically, slowly. He let his words sink in before continuing. But, reasonable suspicion? Not a gut feeling. Not a guess. And certainly not a tool to justify locking up innocent people just because they make you uncomfortable. Mercer was startled. Briggs clenched his fists, his knuckles white, but said nothing. Nathan leaned forward, his gaze as hard as a scalpel. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the intensity in each word. Tell me, officers. Did I resist when I stood outside my car? Briggs looked down at the table, his jaw tense. Mercer swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in the heavy silence that filled the room. Did I obstruct justice when I gave you my identification and complied with your orders? Still no answer. But their silence said it all. Nathan nodded, as if this was what he had expected. He turned to face the department representative, who was sitting stiffly at the table. The air in the room was thick, tense enough to cut with a knife. Officer Mercer and Sergeant Briggs have a history of suspicious stops. Aren't they the department representatives who have been complained about before? The representative hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There have been complaints before, but no action was taken. The silence fell again, heavier, more oppressive. Nathan exhaled, slowly but surely, as if he were holding back a rising wave of anger. This is what happens. Briggs finally looked up, her eyes panicked, desperate. Mercer looked as if he were holding his breath. You two will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation into your previous stops. Every case, every report, every interaction you've had over the past 5 years will be reviewed. If a pattern emerges, and I have every reason to believe it will, then being fired will be the least of your worries. Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but Nathan raised his hand, stopping him. And to make sure neither of you takes this personally. Nathan's voice was steady, calm but weighty, like a verdict that had been etched into stone. I won't be the one to make the final judgment. A judicial panel will review the evidence. Mercer sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just fallen on his back. He knew that meant there would be no favors, no easy way out. This time, it was real. Nathan rapped the gavel on the table. The hearing is over. Briggs sat motionless, not saying a word. Nathan's face was red with frustration. But there was nothing left. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to fight for. He stood gathering his papers, each movement slow, as if each sheet weighed more than the last. As he turned to leave, he paused, glancing at them one last time. I told you the truth that night, he said, his voice unwavering. You just didn't want to believe it. Then he walked out, leaving them to sit, to face the consequences of their own actions. For the first time, finally, they understood what it felt like to be held accountable. Nathan walked out of the courtroom, the air in the hallway seeming thick around him. His breathing was even, but his heart was heavy. His mind was strangely clear, the moment he had been waiting for. Not for revenge, but for justice. It had finally come. As much as Briggs and Mercer deserved the consequences, Nathan felt no satisfaction that they had failed. Because this wasn't just about two cops. It wasn't just about one bad night. It was about a system. A system that had allowed people like them to operate unchecked for years. A system where the burden of proof always seemed heavier for people who looked like him. He walked past the long line of reporters waiting outside the courtroom doors. Questions flew in. Judge Carter, do you have any comments? Do you believe justice was served? What do you say to those who think this is personal? Nathan paused. He turned to face the camera, his voice calm but sharp. This was never about personal vendettas. It was about accountability. No one should fear those sworn to protect them. And no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. Reporters scrambled for more answers, but he was done. He had said what mattered. Nathan walked down the courthouse steps. The weight of the night 2 weeks ago had finally lifted. But he wasn't naive enough to believe that one verdict would change everything. Justice can't be based on one case, one statement, or one sentence. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start is enough to get people to pay attention. If we allow abuse of power to go unchecked, we become complicit in the system that allows it to exist. The fight for justice was never about revenge. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what he had. Nathan got into his car, his hands tightening on the steering wheel for a moment before relaxing, taking a deep breath. He adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes lingering on his own reflection, a little tired, a little angry, but most importantly, determined. He had just left the courthouse, a place that should have been a symbol of justice, but too often, a place where hope was dashed. Somewhere out there, another black man would be dragged into this night. Injustice does not sleep, it lurks in the shadows, in the empty alleys, in the statistics that no one cares to look at. But maybe, just maybe, tonight will be different. If you believe in justice. If you believe in accountability. If you believe that this story is not just one of hundreds, thousands buried. Nathan looked down at his phone, his post still circulating, comments, shares filling the screen. I know that one story may not change everything, but it could be the spark that someone out there has been waiting for. Let's make sure no one else has to go through what so many have endured. Don't let it be forgotten. Share it. Speak up. Make tonight a different night.